I would start saying that where today we have a rich group, and we'll talk about subjects from ethics, social inclusion and participation, women's representation in games and their roles in gaming industry. These are some of the subjects. So we'll start. We'll have Benjamin. We'll have Aurelia. We'll have VieIra and Carla. We have Patrick Ribeiro and Sonja Gabriel. So we'll start by Benjamin. From Austria, is a MA student from Alpenadria University at Austria, and his communication as the names of ethics, video games, La Dolce Vita, becoming morally competent through moral complexity. Thank you, Benjamin. You don't have sound, Benjamin. Okay.
Now I have it. Classic.
Great.
All right, so I'll just start in. Also, please let me know if the slide changes because I had previously some problems with that. Anyway, thanks for joining in here and great thanks to the organizers. I'm really glad to be part of this. I'm Benjamin Hanussek from the University of Klagenfurt and a representative of our local critical game lab. My main research fields are dealing with the phenomenon of morality in video games and how it can be used not to just improve in-game experiences, but also foster moral competence among players. Besides that, I'm currently building up an indie game studio focusing on critical games while also working as an educator in game studies. All right, so now the slide should be changed. I hope that is working. All right, so today to be ethical or to be moral means many things, from questions of virtues, the categorical imperative, to the care and responsibility for our planet. When thinking about ethics on that scale, things become quickly complicated and abstract. Undeniably, moral phenomena are exactly that, namely complicated and abstract. But learning to find feasible solutions for moral dilemmas is something that has to be learned through a bottom-up process. So let us talk basics and go back to the fundamental problem which Aristotle tried to solve with his ethics, namely the question of the good life, La Dolce Vita. Aristotle came to the conclusion that while we all have different ideas, dreams, and personalities, most of us hope for a better life, a life worth living. In his 10 books on the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle established that eudaimonia, so true happiness in life, granting La Dolce Vita eventually, is something that is enacted, meaning how sweet our life might become depends on our decisions and actions we take. One can arguably compare it with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, where the optimal life experience is to be found in an action. But while we can be in flow while playing chess, we can experience true happiness, according to Aristotle, only on the basis of the sum of virtuous or ethical actions we pursued. Here is seen on, from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where you can decide to let sick people either live or kill them, or let the priests kill them to save the rest of the island of the sickness that is spreading. However, I think we all can agree that making right decisions and taking sustainable actions that direct us towards happiness is not often that easy. We might have the compass, but not the sails to traverse the endless ocean of possibilities. However, studies by the moral psychologist Georg Lind have found out that most people, independent of culture and social background, possess similar moral orientations. So we want to help others, we want to say the truth, we want to do good for ourselves, we want to make this world a better place. But if that is the case, why is it that we are witnessing a world in turmoil, corruption on the rise, fascist and omni-religious ideas advancing, and social gaps widening? The reason is that even though we might have moral principles, we do seldomly have the moral competence to translate these into actions. So moral competence is the ability to solve moral conflicts with no violence and no deception involved, efficiently and confident with the result or the decision that one did, an empirically measurable concept by Georg Lind. This means that teaching people ethics is absolutely useless because moral principles are already internalized by all of us as children of our culture. But knowing virtues or principle does not translate into action. So Plato's dogma of knowing does not hold eventually. And that is why we need to strengthen our moral competence and that of newer generations, ideally with the help of video games such as Civilization, Papers, Please, or Frostpunk. To be exact, games of higher moral complexity. Moral complexity is the notion I've been working on for the last year and is a tool to categorize moral encounters in different games after a kind of simplified rating system. In a nutshell, moral complexity is the degree to which a game enables alternatives and critical commentary on violence and deceit. Low moral complexity would be something like GTA 5 or Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, where you have basically no alternatives to progress the game. You have to enforce violence. Medium moral complexity would be something such as The Last of Us or Senua's Sacrifice, where we eventually have to enforce violence, but we have a critical commentary of the game framing the violence and deceit happening over there. And high moral complexity would be something such as Civilization or Papers, Please, where you have frequently and most of the time alternatives and commentary to violence and deceit. Naturally, you'll think now, great, I play all of these games of high moral complexity, but I still do not manage to be the moral being that I would like to be. And the reason for that might be twofolded. On one side, we can argue with Hausinger's classic concept of the magic circle, so in which in-game experiences remain within their bonds. However, this does not mean that we cannot transfer these experiences outside of the games. Just think about the communities of World of Warcraft or Dark Souls, where the whole in-game world is bleeding into the real world through the lore, through conventions, through meetups, and basically occupy millions of people in the real world. But in most of these cases where games bleed into the real world, we observe social interaction, or to frame it in Habermas terms, with communicative action, the consensus achieving force of linguistic processes of reaching an understanding. So basically, critical but peaceful deliberation on topics in order to find a consensus. So to put this all now into relation before wrapping this up, is that we have talked about moral competence as a key to a better life. So strengthening moral competence through video games would sound like the right idea, but playing morally complex games alone will not increase our moral competence because of the limitations of the magic circle. However, these limitations can be circumvented by communicative action, reviving in-game experience by critical but peaceful social interaction, talking about these games basically. So if we want to become moral competent in order to make better life decisions for us and our environment, we need to not just play morally complex games, but discuss these experiences critically with our peers, colleagues, friends, and family. Georg Lind, so the psychologist who developed the concept of moral competence, did not just develop that notion, but also a way to strengthen it, namely the Constance method of dilemma discussion. It is a workshop done in schools and other institutions where participants discuss dilemmas according to carefully structured workshops. These KMDD sessions have empirically verified the increase of moral competence of their participants. These sessions use, however, written dilemmas. I imagine such sessions with video games instead. I argue that implementing games like Papers, Please or other games of higher moral complexity, like This War of Mine and Civilization, carefully into constructed discussion workshops is one example of how to make use of games for necessary and sustainable social impact. I believe that games of higher moral complexity remain entertainment, might be inspiring at most when they are only treated by themselves. However, once they become part of critical progressive discourse by the principle of communicative action, they become magnificent tools of moral progress. And though moral progress endorsed by increased moral competence, we come eventually a step closer to what ethics has been always about, namely la dolce vita, the good life, or at least making decisions that brings us a bit closer to a better life quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. You're very rigorous with the time. It was very, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. So let's pass to Aurelia. Aurelia is there, right? Aurelia is a researcher from the University of Ghana, and the name of the communication is Leveling the Playing Field, Exploring Opportunities for Inclusiveness and Participation through Gaming. Thank you, Aurelia.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you. So in this 10 minutes, I'm going to be sharing with you insights from. Okay. So in this 10 minutes, I'm going to be sharing with you insights from what is part of a larger project, what I'm calling a passion project, simply because it is driven by a very personal and deep conviction that gaming is an important, or has become an important subculture in Africa and in Ghana. And yet significant attention is not almost being paid to the gaming industry. Perhaps because the creative industries more broadly it hasn't received a lot of attention. And so perhaps one of the reasons why gaming is almost lost in all of creative industries discourse is part of it. And so that's just to say that I'll be sharing insights from sort of a larger project that I'm looking at. Gaming is not new to Ghana, gaming is not new to Africa, but thanks to the internet and new media and improved access, there's a lot of uptake in video gaming in Africa and in Ghana specifically. But this uptake in video games has not led to an uptake in video game development in Africa. Now, I believe this has implications both at national and on a more global level as well, because what this means is that games that are produced. So what I'm saying is that this has implications both at national and global levels in terms of game development of games that are inclusive and representative of the diversity of society that we are in, even within the continent of Africa. There's such a diversity in terms of language and representation and lots of things. But because the uptake of game development is almost in its initial or baby stages, it almost presents that challenge. So the objective here in this study for me was to look at the operations of Leti Arts. Now, Leti Arts is the only commercially viable game company in Ghana and one of the very few in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So it was to look at Leti Arts. It almost envisages as a prototype to developing inclusive and participatory games from Africa. Now, the reason my focus is on Leti, again, to restate that it is the only commercially established game development company in Ghana and pioneering in Africa. In Ghana, there are some game development companies, but they tend to be very solo, and the game developers almost work on game development as a part-time or a hobby rather than something that is full-time. And so Leti presents an opportunity for us to be able to look at the gaming industry, to interrogate opportunities therein, their mode of operation, and then almost to look at the successes and challenges. Also, another reason why Leti is such a good case to look at is the distinctive approach it presents in the kind of games that it develops. And I'll get to that in a second. So the research questions that I look at is, how does Leti Arts, through its game development, foster inclusion and participation? And then what are some of the challenges that a company like Leti faces? The methods that I used was a phenomenological approach, because I was interested in looking at Leti into detail, and then analysis was thematic and descriptive. Now, my findings is that yes, indeed, Leti is the only commercially established company, game development company in Ghana. And this quote I have from a co-founder. So one of the founders of Leti is Aram and Wesley. Wesley is Kenyan, so he's based in Kenya, right? And he says in the history book, Leti Arts is the first full-time game development company in sub-Saharan Africa. Now on to more, I believe, some substantive issues as they relate to representation. So the games and some comics that the game development company have produced are the Legends of Africa, which we have on the left, and then the Prophetess. Now, what is really distinctive about the kinds of representation that Leti Game develops is that their characters are based on African myths, African folklores, and they concentrate on different parts of the continent. So we have Anansi from Ghana, and I am from Somalia, East Africa, right? And the framing of these characters are around these folklores, around these stories that we've almost heard as we've grown up. Except Leti have almost developed these characters with a more contemporary or against a more contemporary backdrop. One of the characters which was of personal interest to me was this character Kamza, and I'm in the process of conducting an audience research analysis on this particular character. So this character is based on a real life personality, right? And this personality in real life has a disability, I believe, cerebral palsy, right? But in this character Kamza, her superpower is her disability, and she almost uses her disability to fight bad guys, so to speak. And it is one of the characters in the gaming that gained Leti a lot of reputation and representation outside of Ghana. Now, quickly to the challenges before I ran out of time. When I was engaging with Leti, I almost assumed that their biggest challenge would be financial. It wasn't. It turned out the biggest challenge of Leti was skill gap. And from the research I conducted, there is a clear case that gaming or game education, game is basically absent in the curriculum of higher education here in Ghana. It is in the last sort of 2-3 years that has been introduced in one of the universities, public universities in Ghana, KNUST. And then the cultural mindsets. And this again is a quote from one of the co-founders. Because I want to change the mindsets about game developments, I always write that I'm a game developer, right? Because culturally, we associate gamers, when I say we, Ghanaians almost associate gamers with people who are not serious and always want to have fun and not, almost a serious mindset. And so he has this is almost the way he's trying to shape mindsets around game development and game developers. And then, of course, infrastructural challenges, right? Internet being expensive in my part of the world. Coverage has become much better, but then there's the issue of speed as well. Really quickly, in conclusion, I think Leti presents, thank you, two of the arguments of this research is that game development companies like Leti are presenting really great opportunities for alternative narratives to almost balance dominant narratives within gaming space. Representations around gender, ethnicity, disability, and then balanced representation in terms of space, the kinds of spaces and places, right, that we encounter in games. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelia. You're just in time. Thank you very much for also a very interesting presentation. Lots of questions already, but let's go on. So Now we'll attend VieIra Cruz, a researcher from Universidade.UMinho, and Carla Cerqueira, that's a researcher at Lusófona. They will speak both, I think, and their communication will be Femcast, Feminist Critiques in Video Games podcasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and hello everyone. We would like to thank the organization for the possibility to share our exploratory research in this conference. And today we would like to talk about feminist critiques in the video game podcasts in the Portuguese context. And we would like to start explaining why we decide to research about this topic and some key points related with our theoretical framework. Firstly, video games are one of the most relevant cultural industries for young and adult people, and involves an increasingly larger and more diverse group of producers and consumers. And this implies the need for discussion about the complexity of interactions inside gamers' communities. Historically, the video game industry has been a masculine-dominated space, from a lack of women on the development side to a hyper-masculine narrative standard. Games have often struggled with the issue of female representation and gender asymmetries. Thus, diverse studies stress that women in video games are in different ways out of the margins, and there is a masculinistic orientation in gaming discourses. And simultaneously, there is a lack of intersectionality in all dimensions, and we mean here the integration of diverse axes of identity, gender, race, class, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. And research has revealed that in many cases there has been a shift from the invisibility to traditional gender stereotyped representations of characters and narratives. Representations actually change slowly in video games, just as they have in other forms of media. Regarding gamers, women have become more visible in games, especially as gamers, despite evidence to suggest an increase in the number of female gamers over the years. The idea that games, especially digital games, speak more readily to boys continued to shape practices of gameplay. To a larger degree, these ideas and normativities have come to shape research on gaming as well. And video games and their communities suffer from the same problems as other online and offline communities in terms of invisibility, discrimination, sexism, violence, and abuse. They are spaces in which large groups of people interact in each other without the necessary moderation or self-regulation, with the pressure of competition, anonymity, and a shared identity that is not necessarily inclusive. Therefore, it is a sphere that is marked by many toxic discourses that should be analyzed and discussed. And in this sense, research also points to some signs of change, with initiatives, discussion spaces within and outside the community that seek to focus the discussion and exclusions, discriminations, and forms of violence, with the gender dimension being very striking. And starting from these theoretical reflections that have emerged in various geographical contexts, we propose to analyze the Portuguese context along the lines of a situated knowledge that we consider to be fundamental to take in here, and to focus precisely in our analysis on the discussion spaces. So in terms of theoretical reference for this work, we brought the scientific production related to the feminist critique of the video games industry, studies around the discussions emerging in the field within gamer communities and that bring diverse voices to the public space, many them inserted in the so-called feminist activisms that seek to bring the agendas related to video games. For example, the case of Gamergate as a way denouncing situations of harassment within the community, for example. And it is here that we triangulate with the podcasts of the community of gamers in Portugal as spaces, as forums of discussion of these issues that emerge from inside and outside the academy. And this is our object of study, and my colleague Rui VieIra Cruz will explain here our empirical study. Thank you.
So I'll start explaining methodology. We chose Spotify as the world's largest content production in music and also on podcasts. So we typed a single word, video games, in Portuguese, but we could only find the types of video games. We could not find specific episodes because Spotify does not address descriptives on their search. So again, we could find the podcast, but not the episodes on podcasts. To that type of process, we searched on Twitter and start a global call on Twitter for searching for a snowball sampling on Twitter for podcasts and episodes currently on gender and their production. So we also chose a timeline. We began on the second semester of 2020 and to the third trimester of 2021. In this presentation, we made a network analysis. We used a specific algorithm, a centrality algorithm with a two-sided sample. But we also wanted to find what triggered discussion about gender on podcasts in Portugal. Was by free will, did podcasters wanted, okay, let's start talking about gender, or was there a trigger? Was there something that made them start talking about podcasts? And then we found two major cases, one on Riot Games, another on Blizzard, and then after on Activision Blizzard, on sexism and harassment. So we had the trigger, and the trigger was also connected to our timeline, our frame. So our sample is composed by 15 podcasts and made by 6 different podcasters. It was around 30 hours of transmission. And by this sample, we noticed that, as you all may see, some podcasts currently work on gender issues. So it's not on a single based or triggered by an event. They have a lot of episodes around gender issues. So we tried to find, okay, who are these podcasts? Who are these people who are talking about podcasts? And you find the one that's triggered in red, that have a lot of ties. They have a lot of guests to talk about gender issues on podcasts in Portugal. But we also wanted to find who are these guests that are being invited to talk about gender. And we find one that's right on the center, Rita, that acts as a connector for very podcasts and also acts as a centrality tie to other people that also with her talk about gender on these podcasts. But we also had to find more about these podcasters. Who are they? So what's their occupation? What's their job? And we found that they're majorly streamers, journalists, mostly gaming journalists, marketeers, YouTubers, and TV presenters on gaming websites. But we also, besides the who, we wanted to find the what there. And then we focus on 3 main issues: the main thematics, what they're talking about, national thematics, things currently being important to Portugal as a specifics, and international thematics, how this gender issue and topic has consequences on international. But we also have to find on the titles of the podcasts and on the descriptives of the podcasts, what were the major words, the major sentences that were being put on. And we find Activision, we find Blizzard, video games, women, but we also have some other words such as culture and community and sexism and parenthood that's also being talked about on these podcasts. And then we addressed all these issues and constructed 6 topics that were largely debated. First one, sexism and harassment. sexism on harassment on live streaming, diversity on video games, with an example of Tell Me Why, feminine and feminist content creation, women on digital platforms, and parenthood. But besides this point, we also had to find how podcasts is debated. And in this chart, you'll see that sometimes they start with a game, and then from that game, the game that appeared most of the times was Tell Me Why, they started talking about diversity. Other option was when triggered by an event, and the major event was the sexism and harassment on Blizzard Activision. Then sometimes the third option, they started directly talking about diversity and then start spreading that diversity topic, majorly feminism and LGBT issues, and started transposing to game community and started talking about gender roles. So final thoughts. We have found that there is a strong and somewhat close networks. On CICS podcasts, there's not a lot of variation on the mediators and also on the people that were invited to speak. The main interviews are streaming, journalists, and content creators. The major topic was sexism and harassment. There was not an intersectional approach concerning race, but there was an intersectional approach concerning gender. Also, one of the major talks was about diversity policies on video games, women on digital platforms, and major topics was discussion arising from international concerns or major events, namely Activision Blizzard case of harassment. And thank you.
We'll move on to Sonja and Gabriel, right?
Sonja, Gabriel, yes.
From college professor, it's a professor at College Vienna Krems, Austria, right? So our communication will be, are serious games on the topics of migration suitable for raising awareness and empathy? It's a question. Thank you, Sonja, if I'm saying right. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. So thank you for having the possibility to talk about my research project in progress, which is about games focusing on migration and connected to empathy. These games mostly want to arise. First of all, we have to talk about what is empathy. Whoever has already done a bit of research in this part, there is not one general definition on empathy. It's quite often differentiated between different concepts, cognitive concepts, which means the ability to understand the feelings of others, or a more effective concept, experiencing an emotion that is elicited by an emotional stimulus, or also quite often a mixture of both. So first of all, there's this kind of what is empathy? When connected to video games and empathy, it's clear that one strength of video games is, or digital games, that they are interactive, so we can try to put on a role of somebody else, and they can engage us, and we can easily try to take on a different life, basically. So that's what video games makes different from films, from readings and texts and whatever. So I wanted to concentrate in my research project on video games about migration, because I have seen in the last years there has been a rise in games on this topic. When having a look when all these started, there's not one starting point, of course, but one game that was very heavily discussed in Australia was Escape from Woomera, which was published in 2003, dealing with the detention centers in Australia and giving one glimpse for players what life is like there. And this really started a discussion, first of all, about these migration topics and detention centers, but also if games should be used for topics like that, should they really discuss topics? So of course, now some years later, we know, of course, games are allowed to discuss these topics. And so the number of video games or mobile games about migration has increased. And having a look at who develops such games, it's of course NGOs quite often. It's quite often indie games or even refugees and people who migrated themselves who want to share their experience. So in my research project, I took, of course, the definition of serious game, which is more than entertainment. And I did a Google search using different search keywords for searching between September 2020 and February 2021. And I found 45 games, which were designed between 1999 and 2020. Not all of these games are available anymore. So some of them, they were included in my research. I just did because of the description and the information I found about them. And then I wanted to have a closer look at some of the games. So that's where I'm now. So having a deep analysis of the games that are still available and still playable, and having a look which elements do these games use to kind of create empathy. So what means do they use for making people, players, feel empathetic with the characters in the games? And basically, I will show you some examples. It's, of course, narration. It's the characters. It's the action, what you can do or what you can't do in a game. It's about player choice, point of view, and rewards. So, of course, there are lots of games dealing with that. One of them, maybe you know it, it's Bury Me My Love, which was published 2017, which is an instant messaging game in which the character, Noor, tries to escape from Syria and to arrive safely in Europe. So basically, she wants to go to Germany. And the player does not take on the role of Noor, but plays her husband, who stays behind in Syria. And the couple can only communicate via the messenger app, as you can see here from the screenshot. So basically, the player is in a more passive mode. And but this game is quite good in developing empathy with Noor and her husband. How does it do it? So there's a strong bond basically between this non-playable character Noor and the player. So especially because of being that passive, that you can just take some decisions and not that many, helps to feel this helplessness. And the decisions you have to take in this game, even if they're not very, if they're not many, they're meaningful decisions. So every kind of message you send to Noor has later on kind of consequence. And you don't know which kind of consequences, so that's never exposed to the player. But you can see that there are a lot of meaningful decisions because this game has 19 different outcomes and 39 end states. So basically the message of the game is life is not fair. So it's really this restricted response choice, helping kind of seeing how hard it is escaping from a country, from a war-torn country. A completely different approach is taken by Resilience. Resilience is basically a city builder game, but as you can see from this screenshot here, it's taken in a science fiction setting. So it's not something where you can identify that much. The player assumes the role of being the camp manager, and you have to manage a refugee camp, taking care that you build all the necessary housing and medicine and so on. Also, it's kind of based in a science fiction setting on a different planet. Basically, it's based on Camp Moria in Greece. And this game, although you as the player are not playing one of the role of the migrants, but it's always kind of this God view from above. And here you can see how you have to decide things, what you have to buy, what you have to repair, what you have to take care for. It makes people aware how hard it is to survive, because the game ends as soon as people in the camp start to die. So then the camp is closed and you as the camp manager basically are out of work, so to say. What it also is quite good at is to show the role of politics. So there are always politicians wanting to give you some money, but sometimes it's earmarked, so you have to use it for this and that, and you as the player have to decide. Will you take the money, but then maybe put under some more pressure, because this game really puts a lot of pressure on the player. And what this game also does is trying to get people to do things outside the game. So there is a call to action, like, for example, not to vote for a political party that does not support migration or does not want to help migrants or asylum seekers, or to help NGOs or to donate money, whatever. So you can see that's a completely different approach, but also being put in the shoes of somebody to manage. And the last game I would briefly present is Survival. This game was developed by young migrants and refugees, and of course a Spanish company. This game is more abstract than the other ones, but it shows or wants to show also the experience of migration and social inclusion. So it also goes a step further when you're already in a safe country, that your journey basically is not over. So for example, in one level, the player has to steer a small boat across the sea, a very rough sea, which is a very difficult level to manage. And the difficulty really wants to show how hard it is to escape, and how much struggle people he want to escape, he want to migrate to another country have to overcome. So this game works with a lot of symbols. There's also the symbol of a person who wants to basically human trafficking, but he is symbolized as a wolf. So, and you can't escape him. So it's really wants to raise, and that's what the developers also say, wants to raise empathy, but it does it again on a completely different level. So on a more abstract level, on a more symbolic level. So, and of course, we could have a look at a lot of other games. They all try to do something completely different in their narration, in their character design, in the rewards you get. So you can see there's not one method within these games, although they always deal with the same topic, but they deal completely different in their design. And they use different approaches. Of course, there are also differences in how the approach works, but I wouldn't say there's one approach that works best, because it also depends on the player, of course. We all know that it's not only about the game, it's also about the player and the gameplay. But I think it's quite interesting to have a look at which kind of approaches are there. Okay, so basically it was very roughly first results from my research project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonja. Pedro, I will ask you how much, more or less, much time do you have for Chiara now for the questions?
For Q&A, it should have started at noon and went on until 10 past noon. So yeah, it's a 10-minute Q&A session.
Okay, 10 minutes. So we already also have some questions, but I'll start for the people, if I can, Carla to talk. Okay, thank you, Carla.
Yeah, so thank you so much everyone for such wonderful presentations, and it's very interesting how they are so linked between them. It was very interesting to watch. My question is actually for Aurelia. It was very interesting for me to check your presentation because it triggers the issues of representation versus representativeness, because nowadays we are very much working towards representation in video games history, but we are not working towards representativeness because it's still, you know, missing representatives of different groups in development teams. And I guess that's why our work is very superficial so far. So my question is probably the million-dollar question, but I would want to ask you, what conditions or what would be the ideal framework to support the inclusion of more African developers in the industry? What are your thoughts on that? I know it's a very, you know, a topic question, but anyways.
I like that you started by saying it's a million-dollar question, because it is a tough one. And when I was speaking, I hope you can hear me fine.
We can hear you a bit low, but no problem. We just raise our volumes.
Right. So when I was speaking to VieIra, one of the co-founders who's based in Ghana, in my interview, I almost had gone in with the preconception that funding or finance was their biggest challenge. It turned out it wasn't, and it was actually their biggest challenge was skill set, gap in skill set. Right, people not knowing whether it's how to program, how to code, algorithms, all of those things. And so if I were to bet my money, it would be some form of skill training, right, in that area. The other peculiar challenge that I've found is that there isn't, and it was on my slide, I just didn't have enough time to almost speak to it. There's almost a lack of quote unquote local interest, because a lot of the funding that companies like Letias are receiving is from international organizations like the GIZ, like, you know, the organizations from outside of Ghana and of Africa. And so it really is a complex question. And so sort of my attempt to answer it would be some form of program that allows skill training, right? And then a curriculum, a deliberate attempt at a curriculum that includes training in game development in the global South or in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurelia. And it's funny because when I was asking the question, I thought you would answer funding, but now I understand that it was not so obvious. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a surprise for me as well. So.
Do we have more questions?
Actually, if I could chime in, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so a kind of a follow-up question for Aurelia, and also I have one for Benjamin. But I was actually more interested in, there's the skills gap, but there's also the sort of cultural stigma around video games and the misrepresentation of what game development is. I apologize if this is outside the scope of your study, but have either your subjects at the development company or yourself, do you see any kind of solution like holding periodical game jams or holding conferences? Maybe, I mean, the company's into comics also. I don't know. What do you think is the solution for this cultural stigma in the particular context?
Right. So the company, yes, is into comics. The solution to the cultural stigma, again, that's another tough one and multifaceted, right? Because these sort of mindsets have come out of a certain system of values, right? Not in themselves wrong, but perhaps now misguided, if I can use the word. What is the solution? I think education is part of it, and education not at the higher, sort of not at the university or higher education level, but if we come to the basic schools, right? Right now we are in the Media and Information Literacy Week. If if there's almost like a deliberate attempt to begin to teach at the basic school level that gaming is not just for fun, like Carla told us in his keynote, right? Gaming is not for fun. There's serious gaming, potential for education, inclusion, creative stuff. Then, even from the basic school level, before our students even reach SHS or high school or whatever, then they'd already have that mindset. Now, we would need almost a separate sort of engagement to even speak to the older generation, because we have a generation that even think that social media, right, is a distraction, whereas it holds a whole lot of potential. So again, and speaking to the co-founder Ayram was very revelatory in that the things that I, as a researcher, even in Ghana, looking what I thought was from the inside, revealed to me that actually their challenges was not funding, it was a cultural mindset, it was a skill gap that made it almost to paraphrase him, that even if we got the money, even if we had all the money, we don't have the skills to, the money almost goes down the drain. So you spend so much money investing in skill, you spend so much money trying to almost prove yourself. Whereas when they moved continent, let's say they attended international conferences or were presenting at international programs, the reception was different. I hope that helps.
When I mentioned conferences, I was saying like the company itself holding a games conference or holding a tabletop game conference or holding its own sort of Ghanaian Comic-Con. That's what I was sort of talking, that sort of initiative. But yes, very enlightening, just sort of pushing, pushing digital literacy at the basic school level. Right.
Right. I will pass on that suggestion. Thank you very much.
No, and game jams. That's also a good idea if you want to increase literacy directly by the company, not wait for the school system. I don't know. And then I just had a slightly cheeky question for Benjamin. Why digital games exclusively? Why not tabletop as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thing is that the nature of the medium would just make it increasingly complicated to deal with the concept of moral complexity. So you can basically apply it on board games, but the point is that I wouldn't. The notion of moral complexity would need to be modified in a sense to also account for board games. The thing is that what we have with video games mostly is the aspect of violence and deceit. Of course, you can also have board games, but the thing is, once you bring in multiple players, things become just extremely complicated for. Of course, like in an extensive paper, it is also mentioned that competitive games or multiplayer games are excluded from this definition because the dynamics that they create make it extremely complicated to approach moral phenomena in a reductionist fashion, because otherwise it's impossible to kind of put these into a metric.
So basically you're going for the digital games because single player games are more common in digital games and perhaps a little less common. I mean, because a lot of the digital games you showed were very systems driven. That's why I talked about, I think Mikhail raised his hand also, I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, you know, board games is obviously you can have violence and deceit and alternatives to board games. If you think about board game RPGs like Talisman or so on, even in Monopoly, you have like this moral dimension, like, are you going to exploit your co-players or not? However, as said, it's that it just makes things more complicated. And at this stage of this research, like, I'm rather sticking to, keeping it a bit enclosed to first go forward with this, see, because there is also, we have an experiment going on where we're correlating moral competence with games. So we're also designing a prototype that includes or contains different degrees of moral complexity. So we correlate that with the players and their enjoyment of the game. And then once these results are there, we can then think, okay, are we going to move now on and see how that, how can we adapt that to multiplayer games? But at this stage, just for the sake of coherency of the research, it makes sense to stick to single player digital games.
Would be future work. I believe
Okay.
Conceição Costa has a question.
Pedro, if I can tell you, that's what I was going to say. So I just want to say that would be very nice. A very nice discussion would be put Benjamin talking with Sonja will be a great conversation. I think it would be a great, very interesting to listen. But you don't have time, so let's go to Conceição. She has a question for Carla and Rui, right?
Yes. Thank you everyone for your presentations. Okay, I have written it on the chat, Carla and Rui. I don't know if you already read it, and okay, but I can read it again. My question is, from your study and your analysis of podcaster arguments about gender issues, what, I know it's an exploratory study, but what is your advice for the industry and game designers in general? I mean, to avoid maybe these situations that occur in other mediums, because it seems that games are good and games are bad. And so what advice do you know in order these games are more inclusive, more representative of diversity, of women, etc.?
I may start. It's a two-level question. First, focusing on the games and some of the things they say. It's connecting gameplay to narrative. Obviously on the games that actually have narrative. And that's why the game Tell Me Why appears so many times on different podcasts, because it connected that topic of LGBT communities very well with gameplay. So that's one point. The second one, it's a lot more complicated. It's dealing with the sexism and harassment on companies. So that's quite different. You can build a plan, you can build training to professionals. Carla has done that on the, other actions. But what I can mostly focus on what they say, they try always not to use gender roles as a token. And the same goes for other topics, but do not try to create something and have that little part of the game. Okay, on that 10 minutes, we're feminists or we're something that you want to prove. Try to establish, to dilute that connection throughout the game. And again, insert it on gameplay. It's very good to have podcasters dealing with this, because sometimes on traditional gaming media, this discussion does not arise. And on podcasts, they can actually give some input, some contributions to that topic.
Can I add only something? And we think that it is also important to include this dimension, these debates with students from video games and other areas that are related, that they work after in the industry, in the video games industry, because of course we are here talking about gender issues, but not only gender issues, because it's important to debate more, to create a more presence discussion about how to integrate more diverse characters, how to contribute to this inclusion, to this more social justice when we are talking about video games. I think we need to do these different initiatives and act in different spheres. Of course, I think it's not a good idea only to talk when we are leading with the industry, because it's better to do that before.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if we have time, but I also have more a comment to Aurelia. Thank you, Aurelia, for bringing us the perspective from game industry that is so small in Ghana. And I don't know if you have read my comment, but my question is, I understood from what you said that there is some kind of a simulation in game designers, in game developers in this company, because the funders are not local, are international, that have their own agenda and the perspectives on the world. So it's more. I would like to have your confirmation, and also to tell you about the microfunding, if you are familiar and you're countering the online platforms that could allow small companies and independent developers to put their own creations to be financed by the world or by the people that can help. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your question and for the suggestion. My answer to the first one, to the question about sort of assimilation by external funders, I'd have to say not necessarily so. It is not an area that I have to admit I haven't explored into detail, but from the study that I've done with the organization so far, my answer would be not necessarily so, simply because on the contrary, I think the funding have been quite pivotal for them to be able to carry out the sort of work that they do, because they do this on a full-time basis, and because of the skill, the gap in skill set, they've had to almost spend a lot of money in training and also hiring professionals to be able to carry out the quality of the work that they need. The other thing is that the organization also sort of has other things that they do on the side. So one of the things that they really do is consultancy work. And so some of the money that they use to run the organization, they generate from consultancy, from presentations. And very recently, I think in the past year, they've developed a game development curriculum, a game design curriculum that they are piloting in some schools in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's some sort of internally generated funds there as well.